2 weeks ago, 160,000 Nepalese people elected a new prime minister using a Discord server. So the same software all of these groups generally are using was used to elect a prime minister and to hold a democratic election. There is this danger that this creates identityism, that this creates tribalism at a new scale. Undoubtedly, that will happen.
Network nations, or whatever we call it, is something very different, where the decision-making mechanism is within the group itself.
But I'm still not completely convinced that what you describe is something else than digital communities or a transnational decentralized form of civil society based on digital technologies.
I think internet power is pretty hard to put in a bottle, and definitely is not just positive outcomes. There's no utopia here, but I think there is a new type of society, perhaps.
Welcome back to the Network Nations mini-series on the Greenpill podcast. I'm Primavera De Filippi, and together with Felix Beer, I will be your co-host in the coming episodes. Today, we are witnessing across the world new kinds of civic communities, which are beginning to take shape. Communities that use decentralized technologies to govern themselves, to steward shared resources, but also to act together collectively across borders. And this is what we call network nations. And so in this series, we explore network nation as a new design space for civil society in the network age. Our goal is to chart an alternative path to the network state, one where technology is at the service of civil society and not the other way around. And so instead of reproducing today's power imbalances in the network age, we are asking a few questions. What if network societies were built from the bottom up as shared commons, rather from the top down as a startup venture? And what if they treated members as co-creators rather than as customers? What if they practice cooperation and mutual care rather than competition and extraction? And what if they cultivated sovereignty as a collective good for the many, rather than as a private asset only owned by a few? And so, in each episode, we will bring together thinkers, builders, and organizers, practitioners who are exploring this new frontier of community self-governance, helping us imagine how civil society can reclaim political agency in the network age. And if you want to dive deeper, please go and visit our website, networknations.network, where you will find our manifesto and many other ways to connect with our growing community of practice. Today, we are discussing the concept of network nationhood, exploring how digital technologies are enabling new forms of collective identity and a sense of belonging that transcend traditional geographical borders. Because we often associate a nation with a particular territory or a flag or a governmental structure. But nations are essentially communities of people which is bound by collective identity and a shared sense of future or prosperity. And many diasporas, like the Jews, the Kurds, or the Armenian people, have shown that it is possible to maintain a strong sense of belonging and collective identity despite not being in the same geographical space. And so, with the advent of digital communication networks, many people around the world can now cultivate the same sense of collective identity and belonging at a whole new scale. So today, we are joined by three distinguished guests who bring their own perspective on nationhood, belonging, and those new political communities. Liav Orgad is a legal scholar at the European University Institute who explores how digital technology are reshaping citizenship in the digital age. And his landmark research on cloud communities has investigated already for many years the legal implications of political communities that are digitally connected. Bauböck is a leading political theorist on citizenship and migration, also at the European University Institute, and his work on transnational democracy investigates how political communities can exist across borders. Finally, Yancey Strickler is a writer and entrepreneur who has been exploring new models of collective organization through initiatives like Kickstarter, who is a co-founder, and MetaLabel. And so together, we will explore how network nations are decoupling nationhood from territory and are creating new spaces for political agency and collective actions that span across territories. And we investigate in particular how people can develop deep roots and a sense of belonging by participating in global communities that are not territorially bound. So, yeah, thank you for coming and joining us in this conversation. So, today, what we want to explore is a strong hypothesis that have kind of like informed all the work towards network nation that we have, which is basically that we've been observing the emergence of new translocal, transnational communities that are not bounded by geographical boundaries, but rather that transcend across multiple territories. And basically, what we're noticing is that because of the digital proximity as opposed to territorial proximity, we're seeing emerge something that goes beyond a traditional affinity group, but that really start having a particular element of cultural identity and a sense of belonging and potentially like some degree of kinship that develop beyond just the fact that we all care about a particular topic. And this kind of has triggered us this questioning about like culture and like what actually makes up a nation until before the network technologies have been always anchored into a proximity that is very territorial, repeated interaction that come from like just hanging out with people in the same territory. And now that there is this repeated interaction that are done on the digital space, and now that actually we are creating new forms of spaces that are new territories that are not geographical, but still allow for this type of proximity, and therefore potentially a new culture to emerge out of those communities. Basically, this is this observation that has kind of like triggered this whole questioning about, well, if there is those new communities which are translocal, meaning that they exist at multiple places locally, but they are connected and interconnected so that they become beyond the local without losing the specificity of the local. So that's where translocal is distinguished from globalism. But basically, what we are noticing is that networks become somehow a substrate for this social fabric that is no longer the geographical territory. And of course, this community can be still physical, even though they are interconnected with other physical community, or they can be mainly digital or cloud-based. But it is this kind of like the network interdependencies between those community that makes them translocal. So this is kind of like our basic observation, and I will say it is a strong hypothesis. And what we would like to discuss with the three of you is basically, first of all, the extent to which you agree with this hypothesis. You have also been witnessing similar dynamics, and whether you believe that this is not just like a coincidence, or it's not just some marginal thing, but we are seeing kind of the emergence of something that, of course, over time, it takes long time to get a culture and a cultural identity. So we are seeing the first glimmers of something that could become indeed closer to what we recognize today in terms of those imagined communities that are nations, but in a different flavor, I say. So yeah, maybe if you can, like all of you, the three of you, if you can comment on this hypothesis, maybe I can give the name to maybe Rainer. You can start.
Okay, you want to start with the skeptic, which is good. Yeah, I've read your great paper on network nations, and I find this fascinating stuff. It's really food for thought. But I'm still not completely convinced that what you describe is something else than digital communities or a transnational deterritorialized form of civil society based on digital technologies. And one of the reasons is that I think that civil society as we know it within the context of nation states is full of all different kinds of associations. Some of them are fairly loose, but some of them are very dense. And they do have very strong mechanisms of internal governance. The decisive thing that characterizes civil society associations is they are self-selected. Their members are seen to select themselves into these associations. And then sometimes they submit to very harsh regimes of, they give themselves rule, they want to govern themselves. But they are not like political communities. For me, there is a very important difference between civil society association and political community. And that is that political community is essentially coercive. It is not self-selected. You become a member of a political community essentially by birth. You don't choose it. And that is surprisingly the virtue of political community, because people are kind of bundled up together without choosing to be so. And then the task of democratic politics is to find solutions for collective action problems in these diverse populations that have not chosen themselves as members of an affinity group or of an association. So the big question is that worked so far on the basis of territory. You have affinity groups, identity groups, civil society associations inside the territory, and they are just like you described for network nations, multi-positional. You can be a member of many different associations of different kinds at the same time. So this is all very similar. But the political community was so far based solidly on territory and political power exercised over everybody within the territory, right? And that I don't see yet in network nations. They are still self-selected essentially. I think this is their basic characteristic. I think this is an interesting development. It is also welcome because if they operate transnationally, they may be able to address the transnational structures of power that are exercised over states or over people that states can no longer control, like multinational digital corporations, for example. So it's a very important tool of democracy to develop these associations and communities. But I'm not completely convinced that they are anything like political communities in the sense that we think about politics as basically a form of coercion that individuals are subjected to. To quote Rousseau, you can only become free, out of being subjected and then forming a collective will among those people who have been subjected to the power. But I'll stop here. I have much more to say, but I'm sure we'll have lots of interesting disagreements on this.
Great. Yeah.
I want to react to Reiner's very important topics and perhaps to remind back in 2017, Reiner and I edited a debate, a symposium at the European University Institute under the concept was similar, the content was similar, but we called it differently, cloud communities. And it was a fascinating debate. Primavera, you participated as well. And I remember that Reiner's back then main point of critiques was indeed the confusion of anything like whatever we call it, network nations and so forth, or cloud communities with civil societies. So I want to agree and disagree with Reiner in the sense that indeed there are lots of similarities between network nations and civil societies. They are both voluntary, they are both political in nature or sometimes political in nature. They are both civil in the sense that of non-governmental, and also they are usually also not for profit. But there are also differences, Rainer. I think the global civil society, the main difference is governance. And the global civil society is not composed of sovereign political entities where there is a decision-making mechanism based on, let's say, one person, one vote, on equality. So global civil society are not acting as a collective or a sovereign. They are more acting on behalf of a group. I'll give you an example. Take something like, I don't know, organization to promote refugees' rights, whether it's UNHCR or some other organizations. They are supposed to represent a group and bring the so-called group view into the political organization when decision making is made. Network nations, or whatever we call it, is something very different, where the decision making mechanism is within the group itself. So it's kind of a decentralized platform to for people to govern themselves, which is a bit different than civil society. But just kind of to go back to your own first question, Primavera, I think the question is not only whether we are witnessing something like that. I take Reiner's view to say that yes, we are witnessing, but it's something different. But the question is also whether we should. And here, not should witness that, but should try to conceptualize something else. And here, I want to say that we urgently should. And I want to tell also Rainer that the way I see it is very much to connect it with the current crisis in liberal democracy or in government crisis. Because when you look on the data on why liberal democracy is in retreat or is kind of collapsing in some countries, there are many reasons, but the reason number one, most of the survey I know, is failures of governance. And so, if we ask ourselves today, if we design an ideal system of governance, given the technological possibilities we have today, I don't think that it would, any one of us or anyone would design something that look like the system of governments we live on. And out of this political chaos, there are many initiatives outside there. I don't know, liquid democracy and some citizens' assembly and some other things. And the way I see this network nation concept is something which is very much connected to the problem of trust and to the lack of or the decreased legitimacy in the current government structure, and try to adjust into a new digital era where government structure shouldn't be, and indeed is not necessarily connected with territory.
I agree with both of you. I would say that I just start from a basic perspective of most human behavior moving online. And, used to be bowling alleys were the most important social place in America, bowling alleys. No one liked bowling. It was just where everyone else went. And so the internet has become the social space. And what's different about the internet is it allows us to reimagine and redefine who we are. We can re individualize every time we create a new account, every time we log on. It's this open expanse of the self and who else is out there. And the world is being remodeled and reconfigured according to internet values. It's happening commercially, it's happening socially, politically. It's really accelerating right now. And I think ultimately, institutionally, that will happen at some point. And maybe where I see maybe a difference of how I think about these things versus some of the framing um, is if I look at these internet-based communities, which I've been a part of for 25 years, and I look at some of the newer spaces I'm in now, where it's people, planning things in private dark forest spaces and then launching them in public ClearNet channels, making money, doing things together, having like private conspiracy, public action. Conspiracy being a nice word, not necessarily a bad word, but just people talking to each other in these shared spaces. There's a real maturation of what's happening and what people are capable of. But I don't think that the direction it's headed is to be nations. I actually think like nation is a strange word for me. I do think their desire for them to become states. And to me, a state, I don't know, I can't speak to the precise difference of a state and a nation or whether there is a precise difference. But if I look at what's happening, say, in crypto, like people are trying to instantiate the right to say set laws, set rules. Yes, they wouldn't be coercive because there isn't a single place where everyone lives, but they are seeking the right to do that on their own. And ultimately, the path I see this leading towards is something like a private state, which I think it is not a monotheistic experience for the individual in the world. It's not like we only belong to one thing. I think it's a more polyamorous or polytheistic governmental state sort of existence. But so much of the energy of the internet feels that way. And the ability for the internet-based communities to continue to self-legitimize and, build up, scale up their work in bigger tools, I don't think is going to stop. Um, I kind of assume that what the corporation was to the 20th century, like the social structure through which a lot of culture in the world was sort of pushed and changed, that's going to be a small internet-based community. That's a dark forest in the 21st century. A group of people in a group chat will be able to have enormously outsized influence. And some of those, as we've already seen, are going to feel this desire for greater capacity, recognition. They're going to push the boundaries of what can we and can we not be. And I think they're going to find areas that are pretty successful for them and that are going to lead in a lot of directions that I don't think are uniformly good by any stretch. But that's what I see from my seat.
Okay, so first, maybe one disclaimer, which is network nation is a very particular area that we are conceptualizing and observing, which is clearly not talking of like the majority of what we see on the internet. I think that there is some, and I would like to let's dig into that at some point. Like I think there is some dark forests of the internet that do have the properties of network nation, of what we call network nation, and other not at all, right? So I think to us, what we like, so when I say like we've been observing things, we also been observing many other things. We've been observing the complete corporatization of the internet, etc. So there is a lot of things happening. This network is creating a very beautiful emergence of like many different things that did not were not as strong before. And we're really focusing on those particular things, those particular communities that are emerging and that seem to exhibit some features. And those features are features that are also featured to different extents, of course, by nations. And those features are essentially a sense of common cultural identity, a sense of solidarity for people of the same group, even though you don't have a direct relationship with, a sense of belonging to something, to this collective entity that is the nation. And of course there is a lot of things that the nation has and those communities do not have. But in terms of I wanted to like connect maybe like what the three of you have answered, which is like it sounds to me that Rainer, you're saying that those online community are not qualifying as political community because they have self-selected to be part of a group. Whereas I think if I hear what Liav or Yancey says, like, in fact, those groups are political groups if they choose to act as a political group and if they choose to develop their own governance and collective action capacity in order to promote specific vested interest or in order to like foster themselves. So I'm curious, like I think there is clearly visible political and economic power that is visible within those specific online communities. Why would they not qualify as political community if they have a political impact? Like what is it that, in your view, require this kind of like non-self-selecting community in order to qualify as political?
If I can try to answer this, I think there's actually no contradiction. It's possible to have groups that are self-selected communities and that have very strong ambitions of self-government for their members. Think of religious or communist utopias of the past, right? That really wanted to disconnect themselves from the nation building that was going on at the same time and realize different kinds of societies. Well, the story is they didn't actually win the game. The nation states won the game. And that's also one question that came up when I read through this. Wouldn't you have, as social scientists, have to study also the size of the phenomenon? How big is this? Reading through the Network Nations draft, it occurred to me that the spirit of this seems to me very much still the early years of the internet, where the idea was it's egalitarian, it's open, it's actually an alternative to the across the structures of the nation states and their territories that we know. There is a real possibility, there is a political utopia buried in the internet. This is what the network nations seem to me to try to keep alive. But the question is, does it scale up? You describe yourself, you know, how corporations and states have instrumentalized the internet. They have captured it to a large extent. And not completely, because these spaces, these alternative spaces still exist. But the question is, do you see still the utopian potential in this? Do you think that the small number of people participating in this and seeing this as one of their primary identities, that they belong to one of these network nations, wouldn't that be different from the ambitions of nation builders, which was always to capture populations rather than small groups? You know, and to provide a new structure for the world, which is the nation state, and it's the international system that emerged from it. Is that utopia still kind of credible? Or isn't there the danger that you build up a beautiful network nation, and then eventually, if it's successful, it will be captured either by a state or by a big corporation, and it will be commercialized, or it will become more one of the tools of state surveillance and repression that we see all over the internet. So I'm just playing the skeptic here. By nature, I'm an optimist. I want to see the light. I want to see the potential there. But I still don't see it exactly in that idea of network nations.
What's interesting is that these are states that are like it's like a young state with a growth mindset. You know, they're trying to massively advertise people to join their state. It's like not defined by a fixed border, but defined by who or what you can attract there and what sort of meaning may happen. You know, it's yeah, I think it's a perhaps a start of a different type that um, I don't know if I worry about them being overcome by commercial or state actors so much as I think that there's a internet culture is going to produce its own type of different sort of desirable or less desirable actors and dynamics. I mean, I think internet power is pretty hard to put in a bottle, and definitely is not just positive outcomes. There's no utopia here, but I think there is a new type of society, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that the the mm, um, the observation that we have, and of course we've been observing the internet for many years now, and I think we have had the privilege of seeing the early days of the internet, which indeed was full of this kind of like networked community that felt that things will change because we get networked, and then we can like organize decentralized in a distributed manner, etc. I would say that like the network nation, I think the fact that the internet has become commercialized should not remove from the fact that the internet is the internet, and maybe it's beyond the internet, is the fact that we are more networked in general, right? Is actually, and I think this is the core point, right? Is like the fact that sometimes, and I guess it depends which community we are each part of, but sometimes you encounter people that are not at all from the same geographical space, but because they have been hanging out in the same digital territories, because there has been actually this culture that has emerged. It's not just like an online community where we care about the hobby of like whatever, right? It's not just like, oh, we like to do open source software. Is that there is an actual culture around open source which goes beyond the communal interest in openness. It's actually because we spend so much time on those forums, on those communities, talking to each other on a daily basis, more so than we actually spend time with our neighbors on a daily basis. All of a sudden, that culture is actually becoming something, and of course, it's very early because the internet is young, so it takes ages to actually create like a strong cultural identity. And yet we are witnessing this, and it's obviously not something that you see on the social media, on Twitter or Facebook, because those are not actual spaces that enable this type of cultural embedness to emerge, but there are those fears, and I think, Yancey, you will call them those dark forests. Those are those areas on the internet that have a very strong cultural identity, and people actually recognize themselves as being part of that group, not because we care about the same thing, but because we are part of the same culture. This is something that, if it gets corporatized, ends up like Facebook, which obviously is just trying to monetize the social graph, but that doesn't tap into this culture element that we're actually trying to extrapolate.
I want to step in on and try to, because I think we talk about different questions, but just on a side note, um, the way I see it is that one of the goals of network nations is actually precisely to get rid of this commercialization of the internet and empower the people. But back to the question, the way I feel that we talk about three different issues. One is whether, and you start with this question, Primavera, whether we are witnessing the emergence of a new government system, whatever we call them, and so this is more like an empirical observation. Is it existing or not? The second is how to call it, how to do the typology of what is it exactly? Is it a nation? Is it a state? And so on. And the third is this is more conceptual question. And the third is more normative question: is it good or not? Should we encourage it or not? Is it something that we should welcome or try to minimize? On the first question on whether it exists or not, I agree with Reiner that it's still at a very early stage. So obviously there are this new form of government. They are evolving both because there are new technological possibilities, but also, and I go back to this point because I think it's essential, because of the crisis of our old institution, of our contemporary government systems. So when there is a crisis and lack of legitimacy and lack of trust in the current institution, and people have new technological possibilities, they look for new government system. Now, how to call it? Here, I think that there is a problem because we try to put label of the old world structure, of the old world terminology that we have, nation, state, political communities, into something which might be different. Yancey says more like a state. I think that the problem with the state is that the state, at least legally, is by definition a territorial unit. This is at least the international law definition. Of course, the definition is declarative, so it doesn't mean that we can't change the definition, and with new possibilities we can revise our definition and so forth. But the way we understand state currently under international law and politics is it's a territorial unit. Now, with nation, it's also problematic for different reasons, because of course you have the French concept of nation, with a kind of a community of individual with certain rights and duties based on equalities, but you also have kind of the more traditional German notion of nation, which requires also identity and culture and some ethnic origin and so on. So none of those concepts for me is perfectly fit to the new phenomenon that we are witnessing. It's a nice attempt of each of us to kind of put a label and to call it but clearly there is something new here, whether we call it a nation or a state or a political community or an upgrade version of a decentralized civil society. And then the last question, of course, whether it's good or not, and I would keep this question maybe to a later discussion.
Yeah, so I wanna jump back on this because I think this is the core of the questioning that we have, right? It's like, when you say it's something new, what's new and what's not new, right? I will answer what I think is not new, and then you can answer what's new. What I think is not new is actually, it seems to me that the reason we choose the name nation is because it's extremely salient in describing what we observe, even though nation has a lot of connotation around the nation state. But if we really just look at the nation, is basically individuals that feel that they belong to a same cultural identity and that have an interest in fostering that group of people because they are part of that whole, and the survival of the community is also part of their own survival because we recognize all as being part of the whole. And this is something that, as you say, like I guess originally this type of sentiment towards others is really hard to achieve anywhere else but on a territorial basis because of proximity, repeated interaction, because we share, by definition, we share a common future. Because if there is like some tragedy in our territory, we are all victims of that. And so we want to make sure that our territory is safe and etc. And so that leads to creating a state for governing the nation. But if we separate the institutional scaffolding from the actual group of people, the group of people is just people that who not even have a territory and yet have a very strong sense of belonging, of kinship, and of solidarity, which motivate them from, because you want to foster. So it's like what we're distinguishing within the network nationals is between like when you have like communities that have an intrinsic purpose, where the actual purpose is the community in and of itself. You want to make sure that the community is doing well and is thriving, versus community with an external purpose, which is perhaps like a community of like environmental activists. In this case, the community is a means to an end, and the end is we need to save the planet, and therefore let's grab people together to save the planet, versus a community like a nation where the intrinsic purpose is we want the community to exist, to prosper, and to continue to survive, and therefore collective action is the means to the end, where the end is the community itself. And I think this is, at least to us, an important distinction between what is a traditional online internet community, which usually is an affinity group where people coalesce because they have a collective external purpose, versus those particular community which are special because they have developed such a sense of cultural identity that the end is the community rather than the objective that the community might have in common.
I think though we are getting closer to some kind of agreement. I think what's you've just talked about what's not entirely new about this idea, and that's the idea that people often have a strong desire to share community with others whom they believe to have similar identities, not just ideas, not just political goals, but they think they belong together because of a shared identity. Now, as if you leave aside the idea that they also want to exercise political power over themselves, then that phenomenon is a very old one and it used to be called ethnicity. This is what ethnic identity is about. It's basically you imagine that you belong together with other people whom you don't also know personally because of a shared identity that very often is rooted in descent, but essentially is rooted in a shared culture, right? Now, if you add to this then the further idea that is essential for nationhood and that distinguishes ethnicity from nationhood, that there is a desire to exercise collective self-government within that group. That's again something that you emphasize, that you think these people want not just to be together, hang out in the internet with people that are like themselves, but they want to give themselves rules, you know? It could be even taxation, rules of behavior, who belong, how to exclude, how to include people. There could be a whole system of governance that emerges in such online based communities. I think all that is possible, and you study it, and I believe you that it does exist. I'm still slightly skeptical about the potential for upscaling this. But the really new thing about this is the non-territoriality. It's that you can have proximity used to be premised on physical proximity. And therefore, the idea was only in a territory can you govern yourselves collectively. You need the physical proximity to have this merger between the idea of a shared collective identity and collective self-government. Now, what you are suggesting is we have a different type of proximity. We have the possibility to be very proximate, even maybe more proximate than with your physical neighbors in digital spaces, right? And therefore, there is a potential for something like affinity or identity-based political communities to emerge there. I still think, when I look at the real world, where do we observe the use of these instruments? For example, in diaspora communities, very often it's still hooked to a state and its territory and the political conflicts that go on there. And then this is used to expand the reach of the national state-based community beyond territorial limits to a global scale. So you have global nations that are basically diaspora nations that still have a territory that they see as their homeland, and that's crucial for their identity. And they have shared ideas what should become politically with that homeland, but they use the instrument of the internet to realize this political ambition. The idea that you would drop also the homeland, the territory, out of that equation, and that you would just create political communities that are like nation states, but without the state and without the territory, is still, I think, rather fanciful. It's utopian in my sense. I'm not entirely sure, and that was Liav's last question. Well, now we're still talking about how to describe the phenomenon, not whether we think it's positive, but if we think what is positive about this, my worry is if this were possible to scale up to so that most of humanity belongs to one or the other, or maybe several of these network nations, then I think because of the self-selection mechanism, what we would find is these network nations become internally even more homogeneous than nation states wherever did ever become through pressures of cultural assimilation in nation states. And they become externally ever more heterogeneous, ever more different from each other. And therefore, I think the potential of conflict and trouble in a world made up of self-selected network nations is probably even higher than it is in a world of territorial nation states. That's my dystopian interpretation.
And I have a super micro immediate answer to that, and then Liav, you can go. I think I would agree with you if and only if the understanding of network nation is that you belong to one network nation and nothing else. Whereas one is like network nation are overlapping layers of sovereignty, meaning that first of all you're always anyhow part of your own territorial nation states if you have one, and then you recognize yourself as being part of additional communities, some of which might have a network nation approach. I would say that yes, and of course the network nation creates this cultural attraction because it is the people that have been in proximity with each other in these network meals that will continue to coalesce around. But also there's something really powerful about it because of the translocality, which is all of a sudden me, which is a French citizen, and someone else that is like from the US and someone else that is from Australia and from the Middle East and so forth. If we are part of the same network nation, then we also are somehow coalescing across those territories and potentially actually mediating specific conversations and specific political struggles that are more difficult to address when you're only focusing through territorially based political entities. And so this translocality might enable people that will never speak to each other because they are in a very far away landscape to actually create this kind of affinities and belonging because they are part of another type of nation, which is a digital nation or whatever it's going to be. So I think it has both the danger of the filter bubble and polarization, if we like, but also it can reduce the other type of polarization or bounded territorialness that makes it difficult to converse because we have different territorial interests.
So first of all, it's a very important note, Primavera. It's certainly a person can be a member in different network nation, and it's obviously not at least the way I see it, is not a replacement or aim to replace the nation state, but kind of a complementary element. What are the differences and what are the very kind of unique, novel aspect of it? I want to say something on it. I completely agree with Rainer that the idea of a non-territorial belonging and source of identity is not new. So this is about ethnicity. This is a good example, Rainer. Also religion. So the religion is without a specific territory and so on. So this is not new. I also think that the form of governments, when you become not just a group of people to hang out for belonging and identity and so on, but to govern your life, is not new, in the sense that, for instance, religion is also like that. Religion is also a system of governance. Even though at the end it's kind of coming from the cloud, from God or from the Pope, who is the. But what I think is extremely unique here, and this is the point from that I want to emphasize in my way to try to convince Rainer, is that this is a way. If, for instance, if Bitcoin is a way of new way to distribute money and wealth in perhaps in not the best also implementation, but here is a different way to distribute, to circulate political power. And here I think this is a very important and unique feature, because you take groups that never have spoken and being able to govern their life directly, and you bypass the traditional institution of the enlightenment of representative democracy. So just to give you an example to make it more concrete, take the concept of the Jewish people. You spoke about diaspora. There is nothing like that. It's an abstract notion. There is no maybe the Jewish agency, but there is no um, office or entity where you can ask the Jewish people what's their opinion about ABC, and ask them to govern their life and have a Jewish court for whatever Jewish disputes and so on. This is a way where you can group together certain and make more concrete certain concept, and let the people within this group to govern their life and to distribute political power in a different way. And this is I think the unique feature that you don't have in global civil society, or certainly not in representative democracy, which still govern life in a very post-industrial revolution way, in rather than using technological possibilities that we have now, in order to allow the people to express themselves. And I put in the sign now because I want to give to Yancey the question whether it's good or bad. I think it's good, but maybe this will be the last point. Yancey.
I really agree that you know people have organically created these things. This has not been a top-down implementation of try to organize in these ways. These are people trying to speak to their own social problems, their own gaps. Like it's just been I think a fairly organic process. There's a line from a group called K-Hole from 2014 that says, "Once upon a time, people were born into communities and had to find their individuality. Today, people are individuals and have to find their communities." And so the internet is where that's happening. And we're seeing that there isn't a ceiling to where that scales up. I mean, this is within a nation, but 2 weeks ago, 160,000 Nepalese people elected a new prime minister using a Discord server. So the same software all of these groups generally are using was used to elect a prime minister and to hold a democratic election. So there is this danger that this creates identityism, that this creates tribalism at a new scale. Undoubtedly, that will happen. Maybe tribalism is a greater truce than the nation states that we've had in the past 100 years, because there is an alienation that is broadly felt. I think we fail to appreciate many of the benefits, but all the drawbacks are very obvious to see. And I think this is a transitionary period. And what states we belong to it's a stack. They will have different levels of importance. If we even think about the way we've moved from our mailing address being the most important thing to now, like, an email address is the most important thing in another context. We have notions of different places where we really live and reside. And that's just gonna keep happening, especially for anyone born, under the age of 30. They have only known the life of the internet. And that that is just going to continue to compound on itself, I think. So I don't, I will say ultimately, I think this is positive because I think this enables more human agency. I think this enables more human flourishing. I think it will also enable more pain, more conflict, more all kinds of things. But I think it is ultimately a greater unshackling of the human spirit, an imagination of what could be. And I'm certainly interested to see where it goes.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you. We don't have the answer yet, right? But it's definitely something interesting to explore. And to be fair to all the conversation we had in the past, like we continue to call it network nation, and we know that nation is not the perfect name for it, but it maintains still. We haven't found something better. So if you have, of course, if you have a better suggestion, we might be very keen to to revise the name. We are closing now, but before the closing, maybe if you can each say one word on like where can people follow you, follow your work, and get information about how to reach out to you if you want.
Very easy. Google me on the internet. You will find my name, my email address. I'm not hidden, but I'm not. I have to say, I'm rather old-fashioned and try to protect myself and my time. I'm not involved in any big way in social media or other internet groups.
Yes, sure. I have a Center for Constitutional Crisis, can be found online as well. And I have a project together with you, Primavera, and some others on Network Nations. We would be delighted to get people's perspective, especially on the concept and how to conceptualize what we are witnessing now.
My website, ystrickler.com. You can find things I've written. And most of my energy these days goes into a project called MetaLabel, which is building group core software, legislation, economic tools to make cooperation as easy as competition. So yeah, find me there.
Amazing. Great. Thank you all. Thank you so much.